major things that we're trying to overcome with good process and policy in terms of governance are some of the decision biases that we see that occur when we get groups and or individuals together to make decisions. So governance is often set up to try and overcome some of those particular difficulties. So all I have listed here are a series of particular biases that we know occur between individuals and in groups. You'll note before this social loafing or free riding, as the economists call it, one of the ways to try and overcome social loafing in a group is to get that individual accountability. So while we do have things like committees to help structure our decisions and help the board perform its role, that does also increase the way that individuals contribute and increases their individual accountability through that particular structure. Information framing can be a particular problem in decision making, so boards need to think about how they get information, in particular how they get their board papers, right? Because if you change how information is presented to you, you can actually change the decision that you come across. Recency bias, again, any of those biases like recency, the unusualness of a decision, etc., will tend to shape your direction and your focus. So having forms of structured decision making and structured, say, board papers, right, so that you consider all of the elements. So often board papers will have an element of risk assessment, right, so that people have to use a structured approach to thinking about the risks rather than relying on the risk that actually comes most to mind as to how they do it. We need to think about how we go about making decisions, and you'll notice that a lot of the previous authors were discussing the role of positive dissent. Why? Well, it overcomes issues like groupthink, the Abilene paradox, risky shift. There are lots of specific techniques you can use to get this dissent. Devil's advocate kind of position is one of those that we most often use, and we know has more of a positive effect on decision making than, say, brainstorming. So we know that there are lots of ways that we can improve this dissent in an organisation. The final thing I'll leave you with is to think about the overall process on how boards work. So what tends to happen is that an individual, right, gets the papers, the board papers, or the information that they're going to make decisions about, and they consider that as an individual. They then come together as a group at the board meeting, right, to actually make the decision. So what you can see there is a two-stage effect. That's very close, if you remember, to those optimum ways to do brainstorming, that you involve individuals, right? If you're going to run brainstorming, you don't put the issue on the table before the group. Why? There are all kinds of problems with that, piggybacking in the ideas, domination of the group by an individual. And we know that using this individual to group process, we get a greater quality and a greater quantity of ideas. So when you look behind the processes and policies of governance, most of the time what you're going to find is that it's addressing some of these basic human decision biases. It's also trying to address the basic problem of group development, particularly for a board. You'll remember that we said boards are mostly going to be part-time. I don't know about mostly, because there's a lot of boards that are actually single directors, but most functional boards, as we think of them, will have several people from outside, right? That means that they don't work together all the time, which is going to lead to problems into how they operate as a group and how they resolve conflict. They won't naturally, for instance, have the same set of norms, particularly if you've selected their structure based upon diversity, right? By the very nature, they're not going to share norms. So a lot of policy and process is actually about agreeing what their norm will be. Very simple things like how soon should we get our board papers can be a policy, as well as how we interact in the boardroom, so a code of conduct in the board. Are the rules of operation, right, that we establish to get the board to the performance stage. Now, I know that this is a very old model, a genuine 1965 model from Tuckman, and that theories of group development have moved on from this. I don't think the actual model matters so much for governance. It's recognising that there are different stages of development and people will react differently in them. So there is a lot of truth in many of the elements of Tuckman's model about how people perform, right? So if they're in a forming stage, they often stay silent when they disagree. Often board members stay silent when they disagree. Why? We don't have the shared norms about getting that open dissent that we need. In the storming stage, people will disagree, but they still won't resolve. If we don't have kind of any resolution, then we're going to have a particular problem. It's only when we are able to resolve the conflict that we can get the positives of that diversity that we're after in terms of good decision making. And the policy and process we have in place aim to address those particular norms problems. So what we're trying to put in place is a set of governance norms in terms of policy and process that counter these normal tendencies. What you want to counter is the fact that most people seek harmony, not dissent. So what you're trying to do is to increase agreeable disagreement. The second thing you want to do is you want people to think for themselves rather than just react to information. Most people, like the phone rings, you answer it. Most people are reactive. Even if they're working on something very important, they'll stop it to answer the phone. They react to what's in front of them. Boards are set up often for a lot of information to come to them that they react to. If you don't think about how you operate as a board, that can be a problem. And then the third area are these kind of boundary behaviours. So for any group to work effectively, we have to have an agreement on what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. Like what's polite or civil and what isn't. And when we cross those boundaries, it creates conflict, even negative conflict, which in and of itself isn't kind of right or wrong. So I could use a somewhat trite example. Is it okay to swear or not? Well, I mean, groups can work very effectively with swearing, and some groups can be very ineffective with swearing. What's the difference? The problem is it acceptable to swear or not? And in certain settings that will change, and in groups that changes. So that to me is a somewhat simple example of a boundary behaviour. Is it okay to speak over someone else? Right? In one group, that's a sign of passion and a willingness to be heard. In another, it's it's highly impolite, and the last thing that you'd actually do, you'd wait for your turn. So there's no kind of right or wrong answer for this generically. There are right and wrong answers for specific contexts, but this is why boards will often, to counter these, will have a code of conduct. And you can look at the AICD, for instance, has a code of conduct generically, and you can find codes of conduct for boards, and they're often about these boundary behaviours. Finally, I think we need to make sure we understand that it's not just the directors or board who shares these norms, it's the directors and the officers, right? Because they're working with the management team. So there's a broad sharing of these norms that we're working towards. So what we've had a look at so far is how do we structure a board, and then also what are the kind of dynamics or behaviours we'd expect to see. The next couple of little videos are going to give us an insight into what boards really do to try and shape those behaviours. What are the actual policies and processes that most of them have to try and operate as effectively as they can.